So I'm going to go ahead and just start recording.
That sounds good.
Then I'm going to put the disclosure statement up. There we go. Because we have just a little bit of time. There we go. And then for everyone at home, I will be having but towards the end of the workshop, I will add in a link to the CNE that you can go to fill out an evaluation for today and download your printables CNE form or downloadable CNE form.
Do we print things anymore? I don't.
No, not unless I have to. But then sometimes things look weird on the computer, so then I'll print them out to see what they look like. Like Canvas is horrible for doing that to some students.
Ugh.
And I meant to tell Sean yesterday, I swear to goodness, I don't know if anybody else feels this way, but I think there's gremlins that live inside of Canvas because I know I put things in there, but then they're not there.
No, I agree with you. Canvas gremlins are absolutely real.
It's 11:01. Would you like to get started, Maddie?
Let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah, people can pop in whenever they feel like it.
All righty. So for everybody who's here, thank you so much for joining us today in our latest faculty development workshop. This one is going to be on communication. Presenting today is Dr. Madeline Redlick from the Moody College of Communication. So Dr. Redlick, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. So I am also going to share my screen with y'all. And then if you can give me a thumbs up or a clap emoji or something like that, if you can, okay, great. Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for being with me, especially on such a beautiful Friday. I am so excited to get to come and speak to all of you today. So this is my first time coming to speak with a group of nursing professionals. So can't wait to hear some of your thoughts and your questions at the end of the presentation. Speaking of the presentation, let's get right into it. So the first part of our hour together is designed for what I like to call that easy Friday feeling. So I'm going to talk, you listen. If you want to close your eyes, that's fine by me. You can think of this kind of like a podcast with an optional video element. So that's going to be about 45 minutes. And then at the end of that 45 minutes, we will get interactive for those of you who prefer to participate in that way. We're not going to do breakout rooms or anything like that, just a good old-fashioned Q&A like the old days. So if you want to put questions into the chat for me to look at while I talk, that's awesome. But I won't monitor the chat while I'm presenting because I can't talk, think, and read all at once. I just end up rubbing my head and patting my stomach when I try to do that. So let's get into the talking part of today. I am going to start us off today by contextualizing why what we're talking about, which is how to communicate supportively and productively with our students, is so critically important, and it's critically important especially today. So we're going to talk about how to do that. We're going to cover some strategies for how we can respond to and support our students and our colleagues, how we can do that even when we have tough news or constructive feedback that we need to deliver. And we'll talk about specific strategies for bringing that support into classroom discussions. And then finally, I'm going to give you a tool that you can use in the future if you want to check on how well these things are going for your classroom climate. So I want to start us off by getting a sense of where students are at right now, especially when it comes to their mental health. So what I'm showing you here is data from a very large national research survey called the Student Experience in the Research University Survey. People in that space just call it the SERU. So these data come from May to July of 2020, so our first pandemic summer. And what these data are going to show us is that our students are very much in crisis. And I may not even need to tell you this, you may know this yourselves. So approximately 40% of undergraduate and 25% of professional and graduate students are reporting having an emotional or mental health concern or a condition between May and July of 2020. And of these students who are struggling with their mental health, many of them had that stress compounded by some certain experiences like financial hardship, food and housing insecurity, and unstable or unhealthy living environments that they were forced into. And then even further within this population, we know that our BIPOC and our underrepresented minority students, they're even more likely than their white counterparts to be experiencing these hardships. But we also know that students in both categories, right? We know that students in both categories had a much harder time adapting to the online learning environment that we were all faced with during the pandemic. So these students are reporting feeling unsupported by their universities in the face of everything that was going on. And then shockingly, just shockingly, they reported feeling very large increases in their levels of stress. And why, you might ask? Did our students feel unsupported by their universities in this time? So the number one reason that students identified when we asked them this follow-up question was that they thought that their faculty weren't being educated on how to support them. So, a bunch of data on the screen. What does this data tell us? This data is telling us that a large proportion of our students, they really are truly, truly struggling, and we need to believe them when they tell us that their academic and professional performance is being deeply impacted by this. But it also tells us that we have work to do. So while we want to be compassionate with our students, we also must hold them to rigorous standards of learning and doing. And so we here have important work to do in learning about strategies for having difficult conversations with students, but doing so in a supportive and a respectful and a civil and a professional manner. So here we are. Students are under stress and they're gonna tell us about it. So what do we do now? So I want to start off by giving you kind of an umbrella strategy. What do we do now? We can engage in a pretty specific type of supportive communication. So first off, we should establish how supportive communication works. So supportive communication has what we call a buffering effect. And the buffering effect says that when we're under stress, you probably all know this, right? We experience negative mental and physical health consequences. There they are, on our heart and our brain. But when we experience stress and then we receive support from other people, those negative consequences are buffered, meaning they're lessened or eliminated. That's why there's a thinner line over here. And there are different types of support that you can get. Like you can get the support in the form of someone making you dinner because you don't have time, or even giving you a hug. But support very often can just be talking with someone about the stress that you're under, which is probably what you will experience most often with your students or your colleagues. So we want to respond supportively, but what does good support or helpful support, what does it sound like? Because you know this from your experiences. There are those really good, enriching conversations that you have when you talk with someone about what you're going through, and then there are ones that you're like, well, I didn't get a lot out of that, right? So I want you to think for a second, we're not going to volunteer this information, but think for a second about a friend that you have who is just like a really, really good listener when you're stressed out. And ask yourself, okay, what is it about this person that makes you feel like they're a good listener? And when I ask this question, people usually say things to me like, well, they're paying really close attention to what I say, or I know that they really want what is best for me. And these qualities are part of a construct of supportiveness that we call person-centeredness. And the more person-centered or patient-centered or student-centered you can be when you're responding to a student in distress who is seeking support, the better. So often this is going to be things like expressing care and concern through actions or statements that are listening or validating or exploring. But those statements feel a little bit vague, and I want to give you like practical strategies for doing this. So there are 3 things that you can do that make a message more person-centered. So the first thing you want to express is explicitness, which is going to make the meaning of your message clear. So when you're talking to a student, you might say something like, let me try to help you. I want you to know that I'm here for you. I care about your success, so tell me what's going on with you. Okay, that's explicitness. Our next aspect that I want you to think about is elaboration. And elaboration taps more into this exploring part of person-centeredness. So elaborative communication. It builds on someone's experiences or emotions in ways that help the other person to process or understand this. So this used to happen to me all of the time with my roommates in college. one time stands out to me. So in my junior year of college, I lived in what's known as a nightmare. That's living with 11 other girls in a 3-bedroom apartment. And one of my roommates had been dating probably the worst person that I've ever met. And in a surprise to no one, he ended up dumping her over email for like no reason. So my roommate comes home. She's just in like tears, 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 tears. And she tells us all this story of how this guy dumped her. And then the other 10 of us, we sat there for, I kid you not, 3 hours. And we talked about the 100 different ways she could respond with like an extremely long justification for each. And we had to see the email and ask questions about what do you think that period means? Why is there using this word, that word, et cetera, et cetera. We just talked the issue to death. But in the end, she walked out of that room that we were sitting in and she just replied LOL to said email, because she was able at that point to process the sadness and just move past it because we had explored the feelings. We moved through them, right? And the last way that you can communicate person-centeredness is through involvement. So when you're involved in a supportive conversation, the other person can tell that you are totally focused on them and that you want to be there. So sometimes we do this verbally or we do it in our writing, right? So we can convey involvement through the use of intense language like, oh my gosh, or I am so sorry to hear that. I'm heartbroken. It sounds like you're under a super intense amount of stress. But if you are working with a student face to face and they're disclosing to you, you might do this non-verbally. And that's through eye contact, through forward lean, through head nodding, right? And very, very often, the way that we get interrupted in our involvement is looking at our phone, our watch, which is now just a tiny phone strapped to our hand, or our computer. So it's important to be engaged physically with your students. And even though it feels a little weird to say sometimes, it is really the explicitness of the support that makes a difference in how a student is going to respond to this stressful experience. So you want to be clear in saying, tell me about what happened. I am here to help. So that's kind of my overview strategy. And by the way, this is not just for students. This is for you too. It's for your colleagues as well. So there is really consistent evidence that support from nurse managers and coworkers helps to bolster registered nurses' feelings of self-efficacy, like they're in control, that they can do their jobs, their resilience to stressful situations, the quality of their working life, and it minimizes turnover. And we know that nurses who are getting good support from their managers are more likely to share their ideas and less likely to experience that emotional exhaustion that is so pervasive in your profession. We also see this in being a key thing that produces what are called stress-resistant nurses, which I think is great. It sounds like a super nurse. Those are nurses who work in higher stress environments, but they still report really high job satisfaction. And those nurses, those stress-resistant nurses, they both ask for support and they get more support than their counterparts who have low job satisfaction. And so my key takeaway from this discussion of support is that modeling good support and supportive communication for your students now can help them feel comfortable in seeking it later and also providing it to their peers and their colleagues, which creates what we call a positive feedback loop for a supportive culture. So doing this now is one way that you can ensure the future of nursing is one that you want to be sending your students into. But now, let's talk about a case in which you need to respond to a student and you can't be just supportive, right? A case in which you need to give someone constructive feedback to help a nurse improve their performance. So when you find yourself in this situation, I want you to ask yourself a question, and the question is this: what is it that I am trying to accomplish here, right? And in this case, again, I'm not going to ask you to share your answers because the answers that you would give would be pretty different. Because when we give feedback, we often have multiple goals going on at once, and giving feedback gets tricky and uncomfortable because those goals are in conflict with each other. And managing that conflict or not managing it is what makes people avoid or dislike giving feedback, particularly when that feedback is negative. So let's talk about what some of these multiple goals might be. The first one that we have in any interaction is called a task goal. What is the literal thing I need to get done here? And I encourage you to try and figure this out before an interaction. But we also have this thing called an identity goal, which you probably don't think about that often, but it's there. And that's the question of what impression do I want to give off during this interaction? And you manage this impression that you're giving off while you're speaking and you're listening through your verbal and your nonverbal communication. And then there's even one more invisible goal that we don't think about, and that is our relational goal. How do I want my relationship to be with this other person at the end of our interaction? Do I want it to continue, to end, to improve? And I want you to get some distance and kind of assess this afterwards. So let's think about a quick example that we could run through. Let's think about, okay, I need to drink more coffee this morning. This is my Thanksgiving themed mug. What is our task goal? My task goal is to get more coffee from the Starbucks barista, right? I need more caffeine. Identity goal. How do I want to be seen during this? I would like to be seen as polite when I'm asking for something from the Starbucks barista. And what's my relational goal at the end of this? I don't have that many desires for my relationship with the barista. It's not that important to me, right? But I don't want it to be worse. One case in which a relational goal gets a little tricky is think about breaking up with someone. I seem to be really on breaking up examples today. Breaking up with someone. At the end of your interaction, your relational goal is, I don't want a relationship with you anymore, or I want it to be meaningfully different than what it is now, right? And like I said, giving feedback can be tricky because these goals are in conflict. And that's why people avoid it. So when you're giving feedback to a student or a colleague, you have a lot of these goals going on, and I've listed some of them here. So one of your goals is to explain your feedback clearly and competently, and that's a task goal. But you also need to do it while conveying that you are an empathetic and sensitive person, right? You don't want to seem like a jerk. That's an identity goal. You also want to be seen as a professional in this situation, perhaps a teacher, perhaps a manager. That's identity. You want to be fair when giving the feedback. That's a task goal. And you probably want to maintain some form of friendly relationships with your students and your colleagues. Again, we don't want to be hated by everyone. Sometimes, but not usually. And so all of these things are difficult to balance, but we have to. We have to give our students direct and honest feedback if we want them to learn, right? So how can we do this in a professional and respectful manner? Luckily, we have a stage-based strategy that y'all can use. So the first stage of this giving feedback process is explaining why you are about to say what you're going to say. And if you're like, gee, this sounds a whole lot like explicitness, you are right. You're connecting the dots out there. So you want to help the other person see that you are offering them feedback because you care about them and you want them to improve. You're not here to put them down. And depending on how rough the news that you're giving is, you may want to use something called this is going to sound similar again, a buffer. So a buffer in this case is a message that we use to reduce the shock or the hurt of negative or constructive feedback. It's kind of like an airbag or a bumper on a car, but it's for your feelings. And so buffers can take on a lot of different forms, but there is a trick to them. Buffers either work or they make the situation even worse. Because when a buffer feels fake, it is extremely ineffective. So what do we do to make our buffers effective? We have 3 S's to guide us. The first one is your buffer should be selfless. You want to make your comment to this person totally focused on them. Work hard to find positives, even if you truly despise working with this person. So I appreciate this about you, or you are difficult to work with, but I'm trying my best. That's not selfless, right? That's not about that. Also make it specific, okay? Make it really tangible. So they can't be like, oh, you say that to all of the students. No, it's specifically about you. And keep it short. Do not go on and on and on praising this person, because guess what? They're going to get suspicious and they'll be like, I smell what's coming, my friend, okay? So after we've set them up, I'm going to tell you this because I want you to grow, and maybe we're going to kind of boost their ego for a minute. You want to give this person the feedback, but you want to do so gently. So don't be a jerk about it. And here is where finesse, word choice, finding the right time and place, right? Probably a private place, is really important, okay? So choosing our words carefully. When you're giving this feedback, you want to include a specific example of the thing that you're commenting on. So a behavior, a certain use of a certain procedure, the way that someone is presenting themselves. give a specific example and back up what you're talking about with data. You may have so many examples that you want to talk about, right? And in that case, I want you to choose just the one unassailable, strongest example that you can give to that person. And then finally, in the case that it's relevant, I want you to recognize multiple factors. And that means recognizing that behaviors that we see are very often not simply determined. They're kind of like icebergs, right? We see the behavior, but there are so many things going on underneath or behind that behavior that we should recognize. Stress at a personal level, a societal level. Maybe they're in a particular task or team that was always going to be difficult. Explicitly recognize that. Say, I know we're all going through a hard time right now. I know this rotation isn't your favorite. I know this doctor is tricky to work with, right? Be explicit about avoiding fixing blame on that person. So we're going to give the feedback. And then if you're like me, you want to run away. You want to run away from said feedback situation. So you've given your feedback. You want to end the interaction. How do we do that? You want to make sure you have what we call a pleasant close. And a pleasant close, it's a 3-ingredient recipe. So first thing that you want to do is leave space for questions. Ask, does what I just said make sense? Do you have any questions about that? And do make sure to give the other person more than half a second to respond because they're probably a little surprised. So a trick that I use there is I take one full breath in and out while I'm waiting. Uncomfortable for the other person, uncomfortable for me, but it works. Then what you want to do is reinforce the supportiveness of your message. Circle back to this idea that you're giving this feedback to help the person grow and that you're going to be available as they work through it in as much or as little as that person wants you to be. And finally, even though we're closing the interaction, we're leaving the door open. So I want you to emphasize that this is just a starting point, okay? The feedback is just the starting point of a process, and that if they have questions later that they come up with, or if they want to check in with you on your progress, your door or your inbox, depending on how you're working, they are both wide open, okay? So these are really good rules for communicating outside of the classroom. But we're also all teachers, right? So we want to be sure that we're creating a respectful climate when we're communicating with our students inside of the classroom, or when we're working with them in clinical settings, or when we're in groups, any sort of kind of like teaching area. So what I want to cover with you now are some rules and tips that I suggest you cover with your students when you have a discussion-based class or a discussion-based clinical experience. And by the way, these are suggestions for your students just as much as they are suggestions for you too. So in a space when you are having a discussion, are we gonna advance? There we go. Anyways, in a space where you're having a discussion, one thing that I want you to remember is that it's important to share airtime. So as teachers and as leaders, as maybe superior people, we have a tendency to talk the most, right? But make a space for everyone to talk and remember that we are all lifelong learners. And so listening to what our students are reporting to us can often be much more valuable than us doing all of the talking, right? And as you're listening, try and listen with a spirit of curiosity. So very often in my classes, students will express ideas that I do not agree with. But as you are listening to them, I want you to say to yourself, I wonder, what is it that I might be able to learn from these experiences versus thinking about or drafting in your head what you will say in response. This is kind of why we tell students not just to sit there in discussion with their hands raised, because they're thinking about what they're going to say and they're not actually listening anymore. So listen with a spirit of curiosity. Put your invisible hand down. It's also important in discussing, in teaching, in any interaction, to choose your language carefully, especially when you're talking to a group that you might not belong to. So in doing a little background work on this, I discovered that there's some contention around the use of baby nurses, calling students baby nurses. They don't like that. So instead, we want to be very careful about, because none of us are baby nurses anymore, right? We're leaders in the nursing field. We want to choose our language carefully when talking about a group that we're not part of. And part of what can help us to do that is by choosing what we call people first language. So this people or person first language is choosing words that reflect an awareness, a sense of dignity, and positive attitudes about people. So with that language, we're going to put emphasis on the person first rather than some aspect of an individual's identity. So you can see here on the side of the screen in the image that I have some examples for how nurses might talk with patients who have various identity aspects or conditions using person first language. But this also applies to how we speak about our students or others. So very simply, we want to avoid saying things like Black nurses, Asian nurses. Instead, try nurses who are Black. This also might be something that you hear pretty often, male nurses. You can just call them nurses who are men, right? It's not a different type of nurse. You also want to, when you're listening and when you're speaking, understand that everyone's experiences are valid. You may not agree with them. You may be like, what kind of life? Who raised you? But that's that person's experience, okay? And the very least that we can and that we should do is respect that perspective as real, if flawed. If someone makes a comment that makes you feel upset, a student speaks to you in a way that makes you feel insulted, try and remember that 9 times out of 10, they weren't trying to upset you. They weren't trying to offend you, right? Assume good intent on the part of your students. They're not trying to say, I don't care. They're not trying to turn in subpar work. Assume that they are doing their best. And when you respond to them, try your best to use I statements. Okay, so I feel that, I noticed, in my experience, right? Try and put your thoughts and feelings in a place that you own them. And then finally, if you are lost, if you are confused, you should ask questions. Never be afraid to ask questions. What words would you like me to use when referring to you? Does what I am saying to you make sense? Does that help you feel comfortable, right? And the goal of all of this intentionality, which it may seem like a lot, and it is, and it takes practice to get there. The goal of all of this is for us to make a place in which our students experience a sense of psychological safety. That is actually much more than what gets captured by this idea of talking about a safe space. So many of us have heard the idea that there are safe spaces that we should create. And don't get me wrong, safe space and the ideas surrounding it, they're good, but we can make something better. And that better thing is what we call a brave space. So when we say safe space, some people think that safe means free from discomfort, right? And that idea leads people to sometimes stray away from engaging a topic that they're scared of, but that's really important. But when we open our classrooms, our discussions, our clinical meetups, right? When we say we're in a brave space, just calling it that, it foregrounds a willingness to lean into our discomfort, to have hard conversations, to engage in the growing pains that are inherent to our deep and important learning. So all of those ground rules that we just covered in the last slide, they still apply in a brave space, just like they do in a safe space. But when you set up a brave space, just by calling it by that name, you're opening a place for much deeper and authentic discussion and much more effective learning for your students. Now, I do think it is important to recognize, and perhaps this is biased by my own experience, that a lot of the sometimes extremely frustrating interactions we have with each other are now, as a result of living much more online, taking place over emails. So what I want to do is go over a few pro tips, as I call them, for writing respectful emails, even when the email that you get is not respectful. So the first thing I want you to do when you are getting ready to write a very angry email is remember your 3 Ps. So we've had 3 S's, now we have 3 Ps. What will come next? I don't know. What are the 3 Ps? The 3 Ps of emails are that emails are powerful, permanent, and public. So what does that mean for you? Let's start with powerful. Emails are actually hugely powerful in how students see us. So in a 2012 study from the Journal of Surgical Education, it showed that extremely simple things, like using the student's name in the greeting of an email, in fact, having a greeting for the email, hello, hi, right? They make a huge impact on the perception that students have of us. And when we don't do those little things, like using someone's name, proofreading our emails, students start to see us as unprofessional and irritating. And that perception makes them 2.6 times less likely to respond to our emails, right? We create disengaged learners through our emails. We create disengaged nurses through our emails. And also remember that what you say in those emails, they might have a huge impact on your reader. So taking the time to choose your words carefully may be the difference maker for a student who is just on the edge. We're going to go back. Also remember that emails and communication in general, they're permanent. Once you say something, and particularly if you write it down, it cannot be unsaid. And the impact of what you said, it can be changed but never erased. So even though we can often forgive something, we actually never forget it. And finally, remember that your emails are public. Well, this is kind of like an important legal moment. You should never express anything in an email that you would not be comfortable with anyone and everyone seeing. And I'm foregrounding this because I want to make a point to you about when you get an email that is, for whatever reason, extremely upsetting. And to do this, we're going to look at a TikTok. We're going to look at a video. No, not that. Forgive me, my friends. Something just hopped in the way of me. So my students like it when I play TikToks for them. I figured I would bring that energy to you today. So see, you would never allow yourself to get so wound up before sending a text. So why would it be different for emails? So the point of this is for me to encourage you to practice drafting. And drafting involves two things. First off, you want to give yourself at least an hour to cool off, right? Now, this isn't just an hour to stare out the window, right? In this hour, you can be strategizing. You can be strategizing in this time. While you're cooling off, ask yourself, when I respond to this email, what needs to be said? Because very often, even in cases when you aren't infuriated, what needs to be said is extremely different from what you want to say. So ask yourself, what needs to be said? Ask yourself, what is my goal? Again, what is my task goal, my identity goal? And the next principle is one that applies both to parties and to emails, if you will, and that's that it is always better to be overdressed. So what does that mean? It means that it's always better to be more formal over email rather than less. There is a caveat here. You don't want to be too formal to the point where students think you have no feelings and you might be a deep fake. So how can you tell if you're getting too formal? Try reading your email out loud. Do you sound like a creepy character from an 1800s film? If so, try to be a little bit more casual in your tone. But addressing your students with formality, it shows that you respect them. And finally, at this point in your life, I would also think about being mindful of your timestamps. So responding to a student at 5 p.m. is usually interpreted differently than a response that comes at 2 a.m. Similarly, emailing your students at 11 p.m. on a Friday night may land a little bit differently than, say, 3 p.m. on a Wednesday. So the time that you send a message sends a message all on its own. And before we leave this idea of emails, I do want to talk about one specific type of email that might come up. And that's one in which you are receiving the feedback that we talked about at the start of this, which is feedback that might make a suggestion for a place that you can improve. Bold of the students to be offering this, but it might happen, right? So receiving feedback and making it useful is actually hard to do because most of us, when we hear the word feedback, start to get a little bit nervous, right? We get defensive or we get angry, and sometimes we even let that get the best of us and we lash out at the person who is giving us feedback, even when they're doing it out of a place of genuine care. So we will look for things like alternate reasons for why are you attacking me? Or we try and rationalize our behaviors like, no, this was the obvious right thing to do. But that's not super useful. So how can you actually make the process of receiving feedback valuable and one that allows you to actually improve rather than just ruin your day? Well, my friends, you can follow this handy dandy 6-step process. So first thing is stop. Stop your first reaction. Put your crazy face away. If you feel your brain heading off to the races, your body getting really tweaked, take a deep breath. Again, taking a deep breath is a great idea. And while taking said deep breath, you're going to be reminding yourself of something. Remind yourself that even though this might feel bad, the end result of getting feedback can be improvement in your skills, in your work, in your relationships, and generally those things tend to result in improvement to your salary. So we can get good information and benefits even from flawed sources. Also here, I encourage you to listen. Listen, stay focused on the message that the person is sending. Don't interrupt. Maybe in your head, you're going to repeat back what you heard to make sure you're getting the message clearly. Because giving feedback, we've talked about, can be hard. The sender might be nervous. The message might be garbled. Take the time to clarify what the message actually is. When you are done listening, this is hard, but I want you to respond with appreciation. Look the other person in the eye or write down on your email, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with this about me. So it doesn't mean that you agree, but it shows that you have some appreciation of the fact that giving this feedback might have been hard or scary, and that your colleague is taking the time to try and help you out. Okay, now that you have expressed your thanks, it is your opportunity to gather a little bit more data about the feedback. This is not getting into a debate or an interrogation, but you want to try and understand as much about the other person's point of view as you can. So if they didn't give you specific examples of a behavior, ask for a specific example. Acknowledge that maybe facts are not in dispute. Yes, this is what happened. Yes, this is what I said. But is this a pattern or is it an isolated instance? Ask for specific guidance on how you can improve. And then at the end, you're going to request a follow-up. So at this point, hopefully you and your student or you and your colleague or you and someone else in your department, you've been able to reach a place of agreement on some places that you might want to improve on. So if you can, try and close this interaction with next steps. Like, here's what I'm going to do. When can we check in again? Because you want to make sure that the issue gets resolved. So this might be a meeting, might be an email, but say in a couple weeks, can we check in on my progress on this behavior? So deep breath. At this point, we have covered a huge variety of strategies for communicating with our students and our colleagues in ways that demonstrate respect, civility, empathy, compassion, support, all of these things. But I know from my work with many, many people that these things often feel really invisible, intangible. And people are like, okay, I'm going to try and do this, but I don't know if I'm doing it right, right? How can you know if you're communicating with your students in a way that makes them feel how we want them to feel? Luckily for you, other people have done some pretty advanced thinking about this, and the Association of College and University Educators has a survey, I've got the questions up here, that they suggest you deploy a few weeks into the semester or a few weeks into working with a group of students. Or if you suspect, you just want to know, do you have places in which you could grow? So you can ask, do you feel welcomed in this class? Do you feel comfortable reaching out to me? Do you feel like I'm grading you fairly? Do I talk in a way that represents a diversity of experiences? And open up the space to say, is there any time that you have seen me either make you or someone else in our class make you feel like you're not as welcomed, as respected, as invited here? So this is tough feedback to invite because we all want to say, of course, yes, I'm doing all of these things, right? But it's important to know if we're not and the specific ways in which we're not so that we can start to grow. So what I want to do is I want to leave you all with a few final takeaways. And when we're done with these takeaways, we'll open it up for Q&A. And if there's not a ton of Q&A, we're all going to go get lunch early. Here are my final takeaways. The first is about what this seminar is not designed to give you. It is not here to give you a one-size-fits-all solution to every situation. People always ask, what can I say when a student X? What can I say when a nurse Y? There is no canned response that you can always rely on. Your communication is only effective insofar as you truly listen to the student and you tailor what you say back to them to what they are saying to you. This is why I've gone on and on about the important role of listening, okay? Also know that respectful and supportive communication, it is a teachable and it is a learnable skill, but it does take practice. It takes intentionality. So coming to a lunchtime seminar is awesome, but it's not going to solve your problem. If there is a problem in your communication, you're going to work at it over time. You will find the things that work for you and you will find the things that do not work for you. But know that if you really put your effort into it, you will succeed in this regard. Also, I urge you to remember that your communication is irreversible. You may think that your students are not listening to you. You may think that I can just fire off this email without thinking about it, but it's so, so important to a student. You never know when you are that last straw that either pulls them back from the edge or pushes them over. And finally, remember that no, I'm not here to tell you that what you are learning can solve all of our problems, right? We're going to have tough interactions. We're going to have tough relationships. Communication will not solve every problem, but it will be part of any good solution that you have for a problem. So those are my final takeaways. Thank you all very much for your time. And now I would love to get some questions, some feedback from any and all of you who are willing to share. Hey, Alexandra.
Hi, Madeline. Thank you for that. That was really helpful. Of course, we have a variety of situations that come to mind, but I guess I'm wondering about what if there has been a difficult email exchange, it didn't go well, or a difficult in-person interaction. How do you recover from that?
That's such a good question. So one thing that I would encourage, and I actually did this just this morning with a student who I'm having, oh my God, we're on like round 7 of emailing. One thing that I would encourage you to do after that is say, I want to check in about what your goals are and what my goals are going forward. So if we're going to continue talking, are you looking for some sort of like, for me, it's that a student and I disagree. And so I said, if you want to just continue talking about your thinking, exploring your reasoning behind this, that's fine. But the likelihood that you are going to get me to agree is pretty low in this situation. I'm always open-minded, so I'm happy to continue talking, but probably not going to get there. So let's think about if this is productive for you. Now, if you want to make a genuine apology to a student, genuine apologies involve owning your behavior. And they're sometimes hard to come up with. So I also have like a formula-based strategy for this. So it's called an XYZ. If you're going to offer an apology to someone, you want to say, I'm sorry for doing X, right? In the future, instead, I will do Y. How will that make you feel Z, right? So we're choosing an XYZ strategy. So name the thing that you're sorry for, say how you're going to change, and then establish a check-in point with the student.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Hey, Kara.
Hey, awesome. So many great tips. I wanted to ask about the survey.
Yeah.
Certainly would open us up to hearing important feedback, but I wonder, so you get the feedback, what do you do with that? Is it just a personal? Do you share the aggregate with the class? Do you have a discussion about it? I mean, what's kind of best practices above and beyond just like using it to change your own processes? Like how do we involve the students in that? Or if you just talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, of course. I love that question. So this is super important, and it's important just beyond this type of survey for any mid-semester feedback, for final evaluation feedback, etc. Feedback and giving feedback is only helpful to our students insofar as we address that feedback. So what I would encourage you to do is take the results of the survey, review them yourself, and then what I do with that sort of information is I present it to students as, here are the things that I heard. Maybe we're not giving them the numbers exactly. Here are the things that I heard from this survey. Here are things that are going to change. And maybe here are some things that are not going to change, but here's why I'm speaking to you in this way. Or here's why I hold you to this standard. Or here's why this policy is in place. So it gives you a chance to say, yes, I heard you. People want to feel heard and want to feel validated. And yes, I'm responsive and flexible to your needs, but also that there's intentionality behind some of the choices that I'm making. So to explain your reasoning. So I would absolutely, absolutely engage the feedback once you get it, and then share out with your students how it's going to impact your behavior.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Maddie, you talked about when you have that conversation or like a one-on-one with a student to really make certain that you do a good solid closure.
Yeah.
One of the things that I do in clinical when I'm done speaking with a student is that I will say, do you have any questions? Do you have comments? Do you have concerns? To see if that covers everything from what we talked about to making sure that I addressed everything. Is that an acceptable way to use that closure, or is there something better that I could do?
So asking for questions, comments, or concerns is absolutely a good way. I would add, or just anything that you want to say, right? Because sometimes students, I know I get stuck sometimes. I'll be like, it's like a hybrid between a comment and a question. So just make a space for anything. And then I would really encourage you, so asking in person for questions, comments, or concerns is a really great space for extroverts and for external processors. But for introverts and internal processors, they need a little bit more time. So I would say if you don't have questions now, that's fine. But also remember that you can send me your questions in this way.
I just wanted to say this has been great. I
Oh,
have
thank you.
loved this, gotten so much good information. And I think that one of the things that I always hang on to, and you validated it, is that letting the students know that I care about them and I care about what's happening to them. And as long as I communicate in that way, I think I seem to get good feedback from the students. And I think what you just said about introverts might not be able to answer the question right now or come up with any more information right now, but that letting them know that you really it's really important that that you want them to contact you later if they think of something, because I do that because I'm an introvert, and so it's hard for me even to know what questions to ask whenever I'm doing something. And so but when I think about it later, I'm like, oh, I wish I'd said this, or I wish I'd said that, or ask, or whatever. And so I think that's way more important than I ever realized. You're pointing that out, was that, and being sincere, please, if you have any more questions or concerns or anything else you'd like to talk about, please contact me, or, or however that is going to be. And I think that's, you just made me realize how important that is, because I'm that way.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm that way too. So I, as a student, I never had questions at the end of class, but when I went to go write a paper, man, did I have a whole bunch of questions at that.
Right.
And also, if a student does reach out to you with feedback or with a question, I make a practice of always thanking the student, saying thank you for taking the time to raise this with me, or thank you for getting in touch with me. I appreciate you spending the extra time. Something that I think we sometimes miss about our students is that for whatever reason, they're very frightened of us. They're very nervous about talking to us because we're scary professor people, right? And so you want to kind of say, thank you for taking the time to write an email to someone that you were probably scared of sending. And that helps them to feel more comfortable and to come to you more often.
Right. One last thing, I realize I'm going to have to go back and watch the recording of this, because you gave so many good ideas and tips that I didn't write down or didn't have time to process them. So thank you so much, because this has been really, really helpful.
Yeah, and in the spirit of, what we just talked about, as y'all wander through your interactions with your students and your colleagues, if you ever want to reach out to me, Sharon has my contact information. Literally, I do this for a living, so I love talking about it. So please know that I'm always happy to talk with you. And I know that there are nuances to nursing students, the nursing profession, what y'all are asked to do, and we can work together to tailor solutions based on what we know from other contexts right into your context.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And thank you. I appreciate the XYZ framework that you shared with us. I'm actually going to be using that in the next day or so.
I'm proud of you. That's awesome. It's so, man, apologizing is one of the hardest things to do. So I am proud of you, Mary, for taking that on.
Thanks.
As we wrap up and as you maybe come to more questions that you might want to ask Maddie before she leaves us, in the chat box, you should have access to the Qualtrics survey if you would like to obtain a CNE for today. Do we have any more questions for Maddie?
Thank you very much, Maddie. That was awesome.
Awesome.
Very
Awesome.
helpful, very useful.
Sharon, I'll send you my slide deck in case anyone wants it.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Sharon, are you posting this video on Box or something like that? Is what you're doing?
Yes, I will get this posted. It probably will not happen today because I was explaining to Maddie, as soon as we are done here, I'm gonna zip off to the hospital because the hospital is in need of assistance today. The unit's kind of blowing up and I have the afternoon free, so I'm gonna bust a move to the hospital. So it'll probably be later, either tonight or more likely tomorrow.
Is it a canvas site or a box?
I'll give it to Sean and Sean can do his magic with it.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for being with me today. I know that you all are extremely busy, and I just want to say that I appreciate the work that you're doing so deeply. So thank you for making time in your schedule to think about this with me.
Oh, Maddie, on behalf of the entire School of Nursing, thank you so much for talking with us today. It was greatly appreciated and a lot of helpful tips and tricks that we can use with our students and each other. So thank you so much for hanging out for a little while with us.
Of course, of course. Y'all have a great day, okay?
You too. Bye.